Hello, my name is Ben Nisbet. I am the artistic and orchestra manager of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra. Joining me today for this conversation is our music director, José Luis Gomez. Hello, Jose.
Hello, everybody. How are you, Ben?
I'm doing well. I'm here in Tucson, Arizona, but you are not. Tell everybody where you are right now.
I'm right now at the Canary Islands in Tenerife. I have an apartment here, and this is where I used to have my residence for many, many years. My brother lives here too. He plays in the Tenerife Symphony Orchestra. And just by what these weird coincidences of, what to do when everything got a little bit complicated, I decided to go back and be here. And this is actually been the longest time I've been in this apartment. So I kind of enjoyed the whole experience.
So for the entire experience of this quarantine, you've been in your apartment and nowhere else?
No, I've been here. I mean, as you may know, many of the engagements for many musicians all over the world have been canceled. And not only at the TSO, unfortunately, but everywhere else. Actually, this week I was supposed to be in Canada conducting, but as you see, at the end, all of these things were rescheduled and delayed for maybe future seasons. I mean, due to the very delicate situation, for safety reasons, obviously. And so, yeah, I've been here most of the time. I don't know if you know them, but there's 7 beautiful islands. One of them is called Tenerife, which is one of the big ones. And it's beautiful just to see the sea and also be close to family. I mean, that was also part of the reason of being here. And I've been seeing my brother now that the lockdown here in Spain has been a little bit relaxed. So I've been spending some time with him and his family.
That's wonderful. So I'm curious, we're going to get into some of the questions that people sent in for your book club. And I'm really looking forward to discussing those questions. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, with this sort of lockdown and all the cancellations of the engagements and the performances, including the many performances that we were unfortunately able to not to be able to put on here in Tucson, what are you doing to keep yourself sharp? What are you doing? Are you doing score study? Are you seeking out recordings of works that maybe you hadn't listened to before? Or what are you doing to keep your musical chops going during this time?
Yes, that's a good question. I think everybody's finding this time as a good excuse to rediscover themselves. I think in my case, personally, well, first of all, as I said, I'm spending more time due to the schedule that normally I think all of us we have, that we don't spend much time in one place. But this time I'm like enjoying being in this place for longer. And well, you start about organizing, even organizing those scores in the back. So I was like, that was exciting to see things that I didn't remember I had, the things that I conducted. I was like, oh, look at this. And with that process, I also started to maybe pick a couple of things to work on apart from the seasons that are coming and works that I wanted to work with. But I don't know what happened at some moment that I said, let me take one of those operas, especially because I used to conduct more operas in a few years back. I said, let me take one of those that I touched a little bit, but I haven't finished. And I put myself into going through a 3-hour long opera and studying them and then getting to the next one and doing, I think doing a little bit of that exercise of listening the music in your head, which is something that in the book, Maestro Ozawa says very clearly. I think it's part of our job, not only to maybe listen to recordings, but also to get a score, read it, and try to understand it, study it, and maybe getting music that you have actually conducted many times and rediscover it again and work on it.
Well, we are actually going to have a few questions about score study here today, so we might as well just jump right into it. So, wonderful. To briefly review what we're doing here, we have your book club, and the book for this part of the book club is a book called Absolutely on Music by Haruki Murakami, and it is basically made up of his conversations with the very famous conductor Seiji Ozawa, who for many, many years was the music director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So if you wouldn't mind, just give a brief little bit of an overview about this book for folks out there who haven't had a chance to read it.
Sure. I think the title says it very clearly. It's Conversations with Seiji Ozawa And this is actually the structure of the book goes that way. So he divides the many aspects of the many chapters of the book in those conversations that he had. And especially was during the time that Maestro Ozawa was recovering from an illness. So he could actually spend more time with him because, as you may know, the career of Seiji Ozawa is one of those big careers that everybody had admired and followed, and he's been conducting all of the biggest orchestras in the world. So, but at that time he was taking a little bit of time off due to the illness, so he could do this project. And I think it's very interesting, very touching, very personal. So it's a run through of many different conversations, all concentrated on certain pieces of music that Murakami was also passionate about. I think one of the great things about discovering of Murakami, if you're not familiar with him, is that his books are very music related. And I read many of his books before reading this one, and he's a big fan of blues and jazz and also classical music. And so this kind of, this kind of dynamic and rhythm of the book, it's really obvious in his writing, and he mentions it actually in the book that he feels like he has to have a rhythm and has to have some kind of a music flow. And so it really matches perfectly. And he's a big fan of recordings. So he goes through all these recordings with Maestro Ozawa. And it's interesting to see this point of view from a non-musician person, like someone that, that loves music so much, but hasn't had the train to become a musician. So I like that aspect of the book for the audience, for the Tucson audience, to experience that these conversations that we're having now. Well, you're a musician, I am too, but the conversations that I have sometimes with some of the patrons of the TSO and during the pre-concert talks, he kind of relates very much to the book. So he has that kind of not lecturing anybody, but like expressing different thoughts in the best way possible for everybody to understand.
I do find it interesting, though, as you mentioned, that he's not specifically a classically trained musician, but he really gets into the details of a lot of these things. He's not shy about getting into the minutia of these pieces and these recordings and the scores. It's a very, very esoteric book in some ways, is it not?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and you'll be surprised that many music lovers, and I have met during my career many of these great people, that they the passion is so big that sometimes they're willing to learn. I mean, this is not rocket science, obviously, but music is complex in many other ways. But just to be able to read a score or maybe get yourself into it and listen to the music more than just the surface, just the notes. I have found many of the followers of classical music very into it, and you'll be surprised how much you learn also from their conversations. And I think this is something that happens in those conversations. That Ozawa is also surprised to see that Murakami is able to tell those nuances and little differences between one recording to another, and all of these indications that sometimes Ozawa tells him, and then he comes back saying, "Hey, yes, I noticed this, I noticed that." So that's the greatness of music, that it takes only that willingness to listen.
Well, speaking of our patrons, we have a number of wonderful questions that were sent in, and I'm going to go ahead and say off the top, some people sent in a lot of questions. We might not have time to answer all of the questions, but we've tried to select at least one from everybody that I think might elicit some entertaining and interesting responses. So we're going to just kind of go in order, in the order in which they were received. So we're going to start off with a question from Rich O'Connell. He writes, in the conversation on Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 3, the two, meaning Ozawa and Murakami, discuss period instruments and bowing techniques. I wonder if Maestro Gomez adjusts bowing techniques to match certain composers' intention. Also, I'm interested in the on the strings versus the into the strings comparison. Thank you. And of course, this is something that you and I could talk about for many, many hours because we're both violin players, but I'm going to leave this part of the conversation to you.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you, Rich. I mean, this is a very interesting question. Yes, I try to adapt especially with Beethoven, I think it's obvious, as much as possible to the actual, not to the point of historicism because as you know, we're playing with modern instruments and with a modern symphony orchestra. But I think it's being customary that now you try to inflict more the actual original articulation that Beethoven intended. I try to do that all the time. I mean, together with Lauren Roth, our concertmaster, obviously, and me being a violinist and having a certain amount of experience in the orchestra. Of course, I can imagine certain specifics in articulation, especially for the strings, and to get closer to that articulation that I think it's what Beethoven intended. Also, gladly, we have editions now that are more driven towards the original manuscript markings, because believe it or not, and you know that many of the editions that we used to have, let's say for many years until the end of the 20th century even, we had editions that were all very old and revisions that were a little bit not too accurate when it comes to the exact articulations that then are in the manuscript. That there is this wonderful new editions, especially from Beethoven's music, done by Berenreiter, and it's the editor is a fantastic gentleman called Jonathan Del Mar, and those are incredible because actually you discover so many of these things that makes more sense than and it was just what Beethoven wrote. So yes, I'll try to get into that as much as possible. And then the into the strings and on the strings, I think in the conversation what Maestro Ozawa is actually saying, it's something that it describes much of the German approach of string playing, especially in orchestras. German mean orchestras of a certain caliber, like the Vienna Philharmonic or the Berlin Phil, or any of the German orchestras of a higher level. You see that there is this tendency of getting the weight, not the pressure of the sound into the instrument. So it's not applying pressure to play when they play, let's say, a very tenuto melody, so sustained melody. No, they have this weight into it, and that's something remarkable because it's part of their tradition. And I think playing into the strings means into that. Also, you hear the same approach as well in the brass and in the woodwinds as well. There's this sense of weight and for certain kinds of music, I wouldn't say for Beethoven, but for the post-romantic ones, especially Mahler or Bruckner, it's incredible how this intensity of the playing, it gets into the string, not on the string, but into it, like it goes really into it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting going back to this discussion about the different types of editions and scores that we work from. The older versions of these scores, the ones that have maybe been sitting in everybody's music library since like 1955 or whatever it is, the real difference in a lot of those is not so much that they're bad scores or that there's anything, that's intrinsically wrong with them, but they're coming from almost like an editorial point of view, that the person who prepared that score, who created that edition, made a decision that we are going to, instead of having this entire measure underneath one slur, we're going to break it up into 4 slurs or something like that. It was some sort of like an editorial decision that somebody put into the score in order to make something sound or come out in a certain way. And that takes a lot of work for somebody to do that. What we're talking about in this sort of modern sense that we're seeing from things like Jonathan Del Mar and Berenreiter is an equally large amount of work, but what he's doing is he's cleaning all of that stuff up. He's going back to what we refer to as the urtext, or the original primitive text, where it was just, this is what was on the page the first time.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy to find that. Some of those things don't necessarily exist in their completed form, or if you've ever tried to decipher Beethoven's handwriting, it's nearly impossible to do. So to be able to then take the score back to what it was originally supposed to be, where we, like you said, are able to discover all of this sort of like new meaning and context for what we've experienced for so many years, is also a massive undertaking, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And I kind of, I mean, we're fortunate to have people that are there are also, driven into working into this, because this is like how do you call that, like an investigative thing, you start to go and scratch the surface of many things, because also many of these works like Beethoven, especially, and Mozart, and even the early ones, were not let's say the eyes that did all these editions were looking at this music in a more post-romantic eyes. It was more about a different kind of, conception of the music that Beethoven had. That was Beethoven was Beethoven. What I like about him, that he was very far away from everybody else, but he was closer to the classical period. So many of the practices that he had, and actually the way he wrote all these articulations, are related more to those practices, of his time. So, but yeah, they're always valid. But I'm glad that we have these great works like Jonathan and Mahler editions in order to get into it.
We have a question here from our good friend Barbara Levy.
Yes.
She writes, "This is a fascinating experience. I loved to be able to listen to the music as I read. My primary question is, what experiences have you had when a guest artist did not share your interpretation of the music, and how did you solve the problem?" And we're going to follow this question up with a related question that comes from a rather humorous and widely told anecdote from the classical music world. But let's answer this question first.
Yes. Well, thank you, Barbara. Actually, I don't recall having any, let's say, difficulties trying to trying to match a guest artist or a soloist of a concerto interpretation. I think I've been fortunate for that, but on the other hand, like Ozawa is saying, it depends on in which situation you are put into. And so, because a soloist has, that's part of his job, to get there and have a concept of the music. And depending on the repertoire, sometimes they have more things to say. Let's say a Chopin piano concerto, obviously the concept is already there for the pianist, and you become, with the orchestra, more accompanying. Also because the way the concerto is written is more about accompanying. But when you get Brahms' second piano concerto, that's a different take.
Right.
Because yes, the soloist obviously comes with a very clear idea, but the work itself it's more like a symphony. It's more the piano, it's inside the orchestra, the way it's written. So what you try to do, and what I try to do, I think many of my colleagues do the same thing, is like you get together with the soloist just before the first time you guys are performing together and try to see what he's doing. He plays a little bit, he or she plays a little bit. Maybe you make some comments. You try to use the psychology to understand that point of view, because I think it's incredible how valid many ways could be valid. And so you immediately know, okay, this is something that relates to what I actually want to do. Or sometimes it's just very different and you're like, well, you know what? At least in my experience, in my own personality, I said, why not give it a try? Mm-hmm. So I haven't, you can have very different points of view, but normally I kind of tend to respect a lot of what the soloists have to say. And I think it's, the life of a soloist is a very hard one, because mm-hmm. you have to jump in one week to another with different repertoire, especially a pianist that played a recital and then a concerto and then maybe chamber music. Yeah. So you understand that they come with their ideas very clear. I never had the experience of someone that didn't know what to do.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the second piano concerto of Brahms, but this is actually related to the first piano concerto of Brahms. Yes. Now, I think you might know where I'm going with this. This is a story that you and I have discussed numerous times backstage at concerts. This question is one of many questions that came from Susan Delaney. Thank you for all of your questions, Susan. But we're going to go ahead and stick to the first one. She writes, early in the book, Murakami and Ozawa discuss the performance of the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1 by Glenn Gould with Leonard Bernstein conducting the New York Philharmonic. Leonard Bernstein spoke with the audience, telling them that he did not agree with Glenn Gould's tempo, but that he was, in the end, game for the adventure. Ozawa mentions that he still disagrees with Bernstein's decision to speak to prepare the audience. I listened to the recording and thought it was charming, even if it could have been seen as an untraditional way to warn the listeners that they may not like it. So, have you ever had a soloist where you could not agree on a tempo? And how did you handle it in the overall performance? And of course, this is a very famous story that isn't just discussed in this book. It's one of the many stories that classical musicians just kind of know. It gets shared as some sort of oral tradition. Do you know, maybe you can expound on this a little bit more.
Yes, well, we're glad that we have the recording to know what actually happened. It's because otherwise it could be one of those legends that nobody knows, right? I don't know. I never had that situation in the sense of course. I mean, you're surprised that for one particular movement, the tempos are a little bit slower than what that you are, used to do with other soloists, that maybe they repeat some kind of a standard approach to it, even though there is not such a thing as standard playing or approach to music, but more like coherent into one idea that everybody tries to match. There might be someone that just does the opposite. I don't mind that. I never had it so radical like Mr. Gould did with Bernstein, and actually radical. Why? I think it's because obviously, it's because of the heaviness of the tempo that he plays, and the way, he also, makes the articulations are not what you will expect. I mean, especially in those times of the Rubinsteins and Horowitz and all these, pianists that were doing things more like we said, or we used to say, hey, that's the way it's supposed to be. But what I like of Gould is like, he's like throwing it to your face saying, no, this is another way. And I think that set a tone for many soloists in the future to be more, how you say that, to concentrate more on what you're doing, not just repeating what people says, this is the way Brahms' first piano concerto is done. So it's interesting what Maestro Ozawa says, that he disagrees with Bernstein, talking to the audience and explaining this thing. Well, I might disagree too, but I didn't know Leonard Bernstein, but reading his book, knowing his story, having the chance to meet his daughter, Jamie, that she performed with us a couple of years ago, you see that personality of Bernstein. I mean, how can you say that he did wrong? He actually did what he was being Bernstein, and he was being Bernstein for that good thing of trying to also communicate with the audience. And I think that those two things, Gould doing a complete different approach to Brahms' first piano concerto, and then Bernstein also telling the audience these things that they don't get to know or get to see. Because these conversations, even the rehearsal process is something that most of the audience, they don't have a chance to experience. And you'll be surprised how many of these things are adjusted during those times, sometimes even without talking. I mean, you could tell that, okay, this person is trying to do something like this, but then in the concert does something totally different. So all of this process, it's interesting how Bernstein, it's also stepping down from the podium and telling people, and he was praising Gould. I mean, you can immediately maybe think, oh, he's trying to excuse himself. Hey, this is a crazy guy, I don't have anything to do with it. No, on the opposite. I mean, he had tremendous respect for Gould, and I think he was just saying, listen, you're about to hear something that you have no idea, because I had no idea also that it was possible to do like this. And it might be complicated at the beginning to digest it, but the more you listen to it, it's really, really, I don't know, it's just different. It's just that it's coming to my mind.
Well, and from a practical perspective, though, Bernstein has to also be thinking, I have to conduct the orchestra for 3.5 minutes before the pianist even comes in. And so we have these tempos for these works that we've heard and played hundreds of times. They're sort of encoded into your DNA a little bit. That must have been very difficult for him to start that opening orchestral tutti without the soloist playing, to get that tempo in place and set that mood for what everybody surely on stage, and surely many of the people in the audience, were probably not prepared for.
Yeah, and I think we have had also sometimes, very good surprises like this. I remember when we played together with Gil Shaham, the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, that is so standard, unfortunately for everybody, that everybody knows, especially the last movement, how it goes, and then gets to that middle section in which goes slower. But Gil, he wanted to do it in tempo. He was pam, 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 almost the same tempo. And, at the beginning, of course, I want to do it. I said, yes. I mean, this is great. I mean, this has the character. But you immediately feel that the orchestra is like, immediately reacting and say, what? This is not what we're used to, because especially those kind of pieces that you play many times with many great soloists, and they tend to, do that interpretation that I'm sure is very accurate, but get someone that wants to do a little bit different, even for a short period of time, or short part of the concerto, and creates that magic of rediscovering something new. So I think Good did that, and yeah, I don't know. I think those were great times, to see something like that. I mean,
and for people in the 1960s, Leonard Bernstein and Glenn Gould, that to those people is what Gil Shaham is to us, right? Like guys our age. Like if Gil Shaham says, "I want to do it this way," you just say, "Okay."
Fantastic. I mean, great. This is not a joke. This is great.
We have another question here from Steve Bryan. He writes, "My question is about musical scores, which are discussed quite often in the conversation between Murakami and Ozawa. Getting orchestral musicians to thoroughly learn their own parts is the first challenge. Should there be an effort to get them to also study the score? I have some scores, and a vast number are still available using IMSLP, but reading a score seems to be much more involved than what we already know how to do. Is there good advice available to learn how to approach and learn the skill other than apprenticeship?" So I think what he's saying here is when you're reading your own part, you're reading one thing, one line, or if you're a pianist, you're reading two. But as you're trying to digest an entire score where you're looking at what all of the musicians are playing all at the same time, I think he's asking, what's a good way to kind of find a point of entry to be able to effectively read a score and not just an individual part?
Yes, well, reading a score of a larger piece, an orchestra piece, let's just put it that way, it never hurts. It actually helps. Mm-hmm. I remember my violin teacher in New York, Albert Markov, and I started studying with him Beethoven Violin Concerto. The first thing, I mean, when you get to go to when you have a lesson with him, obviously you have to know your part, and you get there and he's accompanying you at the piano. But the first thing he said, okay, you gotta get a score. And I knew Beethoven's Violin Concerto, and I knew that with the orchestra and everything, but he says, get a score, and you are gonna look at this concerto now from the score, because you need to know this is something more complex than just a violin part. And that actually at that time, it was really interesting for me, because I used to read scores a little bit too, but this was like, okay, good. And you have an extra input of getting into this. So I encourage everybody always, my fellow musicians, to do that, because it helps you. It never hurts. And I've seen many times in different orchestras, especially percussion players, when they have to, long pauses, and so they have a score. Mm-hmm. And actually, many of the other musicians too, I've seen a couple of times that it really doesn't hurt to, if you're willing to. It's not obligatory, obviously, but the best way to read the score, that's no other best way. Just read it. Yeah. I know that there might be an easy answer for it, but obviously, if you take a piece of music that call it symphony, call it a concerto, that you're maybe studying, if you're a musician, obviously many things of that piece, if you take the score, it gives you the chance to discover more things. So the best way to read it is just not read your part. Right. Have that part already read in your head, that it's going to go automatically because you know it. Mm-hmm. Start to look in these inner voices. And once you hear it, let's say in a recording, or maybe if you're a second violin in the orchestra, and that happened to me many times, that you listen to a symphony totally different. You start to pay attention to all these other things, mm-hmm. that are also part of your interaction with the rest of the orchestra, but you're more aware. So read the score, probably looking at those inner voices and then looking at the big picture. I mean, it's not, there is no magic about reading a score. I mean, everybody has their own way of going through it. I know it because I remember asking a conductor back in the day. He was actually a conductor that I played with. I was 20 years old, and I played Beethoven concerto actually. and after that time, I was getting on a plane after the concert, and he was also in the same plane. He's a fantastic Israeli conductor. His father was a very famous concertmaster of the Israel Philharmonic, Chaim Taub. That was his father, and his name is Yaron Taub. And he was reading a score. He was sitting with me, and I said, "Maestro, do you mind telling me how to read the score?" And it was Brahms' First Symphony, and he just opened it, and it was like, "Read it." And of course, he had some indications very small. I mean, everybody was their own thing, but it's true. You have to just get into it, and I don't know. It takes practice, but it's like reading a book more closely.
Right. And I think reading it more than once is very important too. I mean, you read it once and you kind of follow one thing, and then you read it again and you force yourself to follow something else.
Absolutely.
Finding one pass through a score, you can identify. You can say, "I'm just going to look and find every time who has the melody when." Yeah. And that will give you this sort of through line through many different things. And then maybe the next time you listen to it, you look for everything but the melodies. Yeah. Or counter melodies.
Regardless the complexity of it, I mean, you can have a huge page of many instruments like Varese Ameriques or any of these complex works of atmospheres, Ligeti. But then you take a score of a quartet of Beethoven, and I think that's even more complex. I mean, to read, because he takes you very in various ways in between the voices and everything else. So you need to read it. There's no other way.
So, let's get to another question here. Sorry, as I scroll through. This one comes from Lee Herbst. Similar topic here to what we were just discussing. When you read a score for the first time, do you imagine the sounds going, or I would say, I think he means coming from the specific instruments, or do you hear it as maybe coming from a keyboard? Ozawa seemed to first read scores before he ever heard them from the recordings. Is that unusual? So let's kind of ask or answer the first part of the question first. When you're reading a score, especially something that you're reading for the first time, what's playing in your head? Are you very specifically hearing a flute playing the flute line? Or are you very specifically hearing the English horn playing the English horn? Or are you hearing something a little bit more general like the keyboard with that?
No, at least in my personal approach, you tend to start hearing those instruments, and especially when it comes to looking at the sections of woodwinds, brass, and percussion and strings. You at least from the very first time, because also that's the approach that you tend to give also, because you're reading the score, because maybe you're conducting it at some point. You need to imagine already what instruments are, and you have to make them sound in your head as woodwinds, not as strings, and the strings the same way as they are. So I think automatically I think of those instruments as they sound, not as a pianistic. I know there might be, because I'm not a pianist, so because many pianists are able, to reduce the whole score into, a piano playing approach, and they're able to look at the voices a little bit more condensed. I think I like keeping the big picture as possible, and yeah, most definitely. And
the second question, or the second part of the question, this is something that I often ask guest conductors when we're doing pre-concert talks, and everybody kind of has their own feeling about this. It's not like one standard answer. If you have the opportunity to listen to the recording of a piece that you've never conducted before you study the score, do you do it? Or would you prefer to learn the score first?
I think it depends. Obviously, you have to be able, as a conductor, to learn a score without listening to any recording. Otherwise, contemporary music, you're totally lost. When you have a new commission and there is no recording whatsoever, maybe you have contact with the composer at some point, but there is nothing that you can hear because it's not pre-recorded. You need to be able to just, make it possible for you to then conduct it. So it's not entirely necessary. Obviously, with many works that are from the standard repertoire, you have already maybe some recordings that you love the most, or certain interpretations that you're more, driven towards, like you like best. So even without listening to them, you immediately approach with that memory. Mm-hmm. What I tend to do also is, like, if I like some version of something that I remember, I know that I'm reading the score, listening to that, but I try to think, well, what would I do here? Is this something that I feel comfortable with in terms of maybe sometimes the tempo, sometimes, little nuances. Obviously, always giving the composer what he actually is trying to say. It's not that you're overruling all these indications. And depending on the composer especially, and I find this very, very incredibly fascinating for composers like Schubert and Bruckner, that the indications are clear, but it's not that the indications are as specific as in Mahler. The indications are in the music itself. So the more you hear that music, the more you read that music in that and try to decipher that phrasing, mm-hmm. then that dictates also the way are you going to make the interpretation. So if you listen to a recording that already has deciphered something different, you're kind of copying. You should be able to get maybe even to that same result yourself. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's a, everybody has their own thing. There's nothing wrong with listening to recordings. I think I love listening to recording. Actually, it's something that it's part of our job to, try to discover music that you don't know, and maybe there is a recording of that piece, Lindholm symphonies or something like that. Oh, great that there's somebody that recorded it. Wow, you listen to it and you have this advantage of having a peek into that music before even getting a score. So, but I'm sure when I get a score, then if I listen to it enough, I can approach the score the best way possible, and also maybe then go to a live performance of another conductor doing it, and be blown away of saying, why didn't I look at this? And then you look at it and are like, well, yes, because this person did this, but what if I do the same thing, but then maybe I have room to do something else. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Well, a lot of ink gets spilled about the music of Gustav Mahler in this book. And we have a question coming from Caroline, which is probably simultaneously very easy and also very difficult to answer. She writes, Mahler seems to generate some controversy. What are your feelings about his music? So try in less than 3 hours to tell me your feelings about the music of Gustav Mahler.
What can we say? I mean, well, immediately I think one thing that many people relate to the music of Mahler, and especially if you're in the conducting profession, is that you can tell immediately that he is a conducting composer. So he's someone that is actually, his profession as a composer, as a conductor, reflects into the composing. That's why he's so detail-oriented. Mm-hmm. But without taking away the room for a conductor to express themselves with the music. Mm-hmm. So what his music means, it means, I think it means a lot of things. It means the times that were changing in his lifetime. It's post-romanticism is such a complex moment of the history of the world, in which many feelings were arising. There were many things that even we can relate now, but and I think his music is very crystal clear into that. I personally also find fascinating, also going back to the conducting, that he was an opera conductor most of the time, and you could tell that his music has a little bit of that storytelling. I mean, a little bit, a lot of it. Maybe sometimes very autobiographical, but that's why when people say, why didn't he write any operas? Well, maybe he didn't want to write anything that it was part of his job as a conductor, but on the other hand, his symphonies are very descriptive in many ways, and sometimes they're even influenced about things that maybe he was conducting at the time, and there is many of these layers of coincidences sometimes, and I think maybe they're not. It's just because it's one man doing many things at the same time. So it's a difficult question to answer, but what he means, it means, I mean, we're so fortunate to be able to have his music right now, even though it wasn't that popular at the time. But right now, thanks to people like Bernstein and so on, it's now very standard to have a Mahler symphony in everybody's season. So it's one of those composers that you want to be able to learn and to perform.
Mm-hmm. I think every orchestral musician and every orchestral conductor always remembers their first Mahler symphony. You might not remember the first time you played a whole Beethoven symphony even, but there's something that's so indelible on the memory of every orchestral musician about their first Mahler experience, because there's just nothing like it. Playing it, hearing it, studying it, getting yourself inside of that music, there's nothing like it. It's so immersive and so big. And that's actually one thing that I miss very much about playing in the orchestra anymore, is that sort of yearly opportunity to learn a Mahler score is always a really magical thing. We have a lot of questions from Mia Schnabely. Mia, I'm just going to ask the one that really catches my eye here at the end. And I would suspect that maybe Mahler might factor into this answer as well. What piece of music are you just dying to perform, and what venue would you like to perform it in?
Well, what is the next piece that you would like to perform? I mean, what is that thing? I think the next piece that you're conducting is the next piece that you want to perform. That's for sure. And that's what I like about these professionals, so that we're lucky to even get the chance to do many things the same. I mean, again and again, because you discover so many great things about the same piece all over. But yes, I mean, there are works that, I mean, in my experience, for instance, is like, of course, I played in an orchestra for many years, and I got the chance to play a lot of repertoire. And as a conductor, I have a couple of picks that I would say, wow, I played this, but would it be great to conduct? And I think one of those pieces, I don't know why. I mean, I don't know why. I know why, because everybody wants to do it too. And everybody who does it, then it feels like, okay, good. It might be sometimes not the most popular in the audiences, but Turangalila for Messiaen, that's one piece that you want as a, I mean, I personally, as a conductor, can't wait to do it. It's not a piece that you do every season, obviously, because of the complexity and the grandiosity of it, the forces that it has to combine. But that's one of those pieces that it's in my bucket list, among many others. I mean, it doesn't really overlaps, other pieces that are also important for me. I mean, I can't wait for us to go back to do Nielsen again and get the whole cycle of the Nielsen symphonies. I was so happy that we could do the Beethoven cycle, but I can't wait now for us to start doing something totally different with Nielsen, which is a composer that I was influenced a lot by my mentor Pavo Jarvi, but because it's just great music. It's music that it needs to be played more and heard more.
To the second part of the question, this is kind of fun. We'll make a little bit of a game out of this. You have to pick two concert venues.
Venue.
Your dreams before. So one that you've already conducted in, and one that you still haven't been able to conduct in.
Well, I would like to go back to Carnegie Hall again. That was an amazing experience to be able to conduct there. The acoustics, the atmosphere, it's just unique.
The history is incredible.
And you're a violinist. I am too. I'm a big Heifetz fan, and seeing, you know, in the backstage, I mean, that those posters of Hyphens there, you know, before you go into the stage, it's like, this is the best thing, you know, that, and being part of that, you know, music halls, they have a life on its own, and they breathe of the artists that they're part of. So Carnegie Hall would be one, and definitely the V Musikverein, for sure, that would be one of my another favorites. I mean, I'm passing over the Berlin Philharmonie, but I think because of the history and talking about Mahler and talking about all these things, I mean, everybody would like to step up in that podium and conduct something. I was fortunate to play in different orchestras there in that stage. It's a very small stage, beautiful acoustics, one of the best acoustics, but conducting in that stage, it's a totally different experience. I've gone through a couple of things like that sometimes, and you're like, wow. I remember in Usher Hall in Edinburgh, fantastic, beautiful hall. We played many times there with the Gustav Mahler Youth Orchestra. Last time I remember it was with Abado, and 3 years ago when I was conducting the Royal Scottish National, one of the concerts was there, and last year also was there at the when I did a tour, and it's always fascinating to say, wow, I mean, you're sitting in an orchestra now. It's a totally different perspective when you're standing the podium and see these halls and the resonance, and so the memories come back sometimes, but also you are recollecting a new experience completely. Mm-hmm. So that will be my 2 picks.
Before we finish up here, I do want to acknowledge a question from Bob Capetta that we kind of already answered. He, after writing a bit about the conversations between Murakami and Ozawa about Mahler, he does ask, what is it about Mahler's music that moves you, that you want to bring to the Tucson Symphony and its audience? What should we, the audience, be listening for? So he talks a lot about the different conversations that they had about Mahler, and he talks a little bit too about this, he being Bob, sorry, about this idea of Mahler maybe being challenging for audiences sometimes, which I don't necessarily buy into that, because I think there's so much that's so very pleasing about his music. But when you are trying to create an interpretation of Mahler's music, what is it that you are hoping that the audience latches on to most? What are you hoping that they take away from the experience?
I think, first of all, it's getting the inner world of Mahler through his music. It's something that if you get the chance to listen that way, then you understand many more things. Mm-hmm. He didn't have an easy life, but he also had a huge successful life as a musician. So you could see those struggles in his music. Mm-hmm. He's very straightforward sometimes. I mean, he's very post-romantic in that sense too. You know, everything has to be decadent to some point, but grandiose to the other. So it's this just a position of something that is, you know, that is just fading away. The world is changing, but on the other hand, you're dreaming of this big sound somehow that maybe will not exist anymore. So if people experience that through our performances, it's really amazing. I mean, it will be a fantastic satisfaction for us as musicians that we're able to share with the listener that fantastic, maybe sometimes conflicted world that was in his head, and that he had to also deal with, you know, with talking about the real world, not the inner world, but the world around him. Mm-hmm. And he's very passionate. I mean, it's like, I don't want to get into you know, the typical thing of saying, oh, but because Italian music is so passionate, or Spanish music because we are Mediterranean. But I mean, listen to Mahler's music. It's so raw sometimes. Speaks straight to you, and it hits you there in that spot sometimes that if you're not prepared, then you can be also affected a little bit, because it can be so complex that you're scared. You're mm-hmm. like, oh, well, and you reject it. I think that's why maybe sometimes people find it difficult. I think that difficult part is what it makes it great, because he's not apologetic about it.
Mm-hmm.
He's going all the way, and sometimes with a lot of subtleties, sometimes with three notes like that beginning of the adagietto of his symphony, just like a letter, a love letter, you know, three notes to say I love you somehow. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, he's able also to hit you in many other, you know, ways of distortion, like in the 10th Symphony in the Adagio, in that chord that it's just it's mind-blowing because of that complexity harmonically. Mm-hmm. And so it's incredible to be able, after so many years, to make a revival of those feelings, you know, from someone that is not amongst us anymore, but he is at the end of the day. The moment that the orchestra starts playing something, part of his music, you can tell that he's alive, that there is something that is speaking to you.
Right.
And so, yeah, I really cherish every experience, not only with Mahler, with any composer, but especially with Mahler, because you know that if you take care of as much of the details that you can, and then you put a little bit of your own expertise to it, and that the audience is willing to open their ears and embrace this complexity, then it becomes a real unique experience that mm-hmm. a 3-minute song, with all due respect, will never give you. I think right. that Mahler full symphony, which is really extends, will be overwhelming sometimes, but if you get a chance to digest it well, then it will be something that it will stay with you. Like you were saying, you as a musician, you can't wait to play and, you know, to get yourself into that world again. Mm-hmm. What is the next one?
Right. A couple of book recommendations, since we're talking about a book club. For those of you who would like to dive deeper into the music of Gustav Mahler, the book by Konstantin Floros is a wonderful examination of all of his symphonic works. It's very easy to find. And also the works of Michael Steinberg, who wrote program notes for the San Francisco Symphony for many years, wrote a wonderful book called The Symphony, where he does these really great sort of deep dives into the history and the construction of all the really, really great symphonies, and including those of Gustav Mahler. So definitely check those out. So I think it's time for us to wrap it up. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Jose, for staying up late over there in Spain and answering these questions. I'd like to thank all of you who participated in the TSO Book Club, and to those of you who sent in the questions. They were wonderful. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them, but we very much appreciate you taking the time to both read the book and then share your thoughts with Maestro Gomez on this wonderful piece of music literature. The Absolutely on Music by Haruki Murakami, his conversations with the great conductor Seiji Ozawa. Jose Luis, thank you so much for your time today. And to everybody out there, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay cool.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.